We've reached the final presenter, and he doesn't know whether to be mad at me that I made him last or not, but he's got the last spot. He's standing between you and freshening up before we go out. Usman Valiante is a senior policy advisor with Corporate Policy Group and has been involved in the forefront of effective and responsible product stewardship initiatives across Canada. He's currently retained by the Ontario Auto Recyclers Association to help us manage the variety of automotive product stewardship opportunities and threats that are appearing in Ontario and Canada. And Usman's going to be outlining an outcomes-based approach to ELV stewardship that could happen in Canada. So please join me in welcoming Usman Valiante. You're just front back.
That's good. As Steve said, I'm the only thing standing between you and getting freshened up, so I'm not going to turn this into an economics, first-year economics lecture. However, I'm talking about what can be a pretty dry subject, which is environmental regulation and public policy. But before I get into the presentation, I want to recap some of the themes that I'm hearing today as somebody that works on rules and regulations and commercial competitiveness and business, giving advice to businesses. We've heard lots of people talk about businesses today. I found the LKQ presentation very compelling in the sense, the dynamic growing business. A lot of us in this room run businesses, and government thinks of businesses as, are they causing me a problem? Do I need to regulate them? And how those businesses are regulating if they're quote unquote causing a problem, whether that's an environmental problem or a labor problem or some occupational health and safety problem, can have either net positive effects or net negative effects. And when we talk of net negative effects, we talk about environmental laws that put small businesses out of business. You can imagine environmental laws that restrict the amount of material, the vehicles you can get to process, laws that restrict where you can sell what you produce from those vehicles, and laws that put in rules that burden you but don't burden your competitors and make you uncompetitive. And the presentation from UK is an example of when you put one little loophole in a law and that turns a market upside down and turns your business upside down. So really I've got 20 slides here, and there's quite a bit of detail on them, but I'm just going to cover themes because these are themes that I think are critical for you to think about, and it's certainly we're thinking about them as governments in Canada have talked about regulating end-of-life vehicles and bringing them under the rubric or the concept of extended producer responsibility. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means and how you can fundamentally upend markets and wreck everything that you've got that's working very, very well in many cases. So I'm not going to go into great detail. There's about 1.2 million vehicles seeking end-of-life management in Canada. About 2/3 of them are crushed or shredded with some or no depollution. 1/3 are dismantled with depollution. These numbers are rough, and as from the earlier presentations, these numbers are getting refined as we go along and we gather better data. There's actually a study that's being managed by Summerhill right now through Pollution Probe that's putting together some better data for Ontario. So dismantling, we know what that means. In aggregate, again, these are ballpark numbers. We have a 94% recovery rate of vehicles, so whatever's available out there that's getting recycled at 94%, and of that, on average, 83% of that vehicle is being processed back into something reusable or recyclable. It is a commodity that gets reclaimed and reused in an environmental manner back into new products. We've heard again and again, end-of-life processing is financially sustainable. There's really two different business models. One is the dismantler model, where reusable parts are put into a cloud system and are brokered, and that's a lucrative business in terms of selling parts, recovering them, refurbishing them. And then we have another business model, which is the crushing and shredding model, which primarily is looking at the metal commodity value. Both of those businesses are profitable businesses, and they operate today, and they drive those numbers that you saw in the previous slide. So what's the problem? Well, The problem is that there's no universal standards for end-of-life vehicle processors. As a result, you've got some players, and we've heard the players that are operating with Retire Your Ride, Recycle Your Ride, Car Heaven, all of these different programs that we have provincially operate to the National Code of Practice, a very high level of practice that goes systematically through the depollution schemes that we've talked about today. Base metal recycling is high, but not all vehicles are pre-processed before they're either crushed or shredded. Other substances of concern, mercury switches, ozone depleting substances, increasingly electronics sometimes are not removed and end up going where they're not supposed to go, into the environment. So we do have an issue with not everyone operating to the same environmental standard. So that creates competitive dislocations. The automotive recycler that's operating to a high standard is picking up a high unit cost per every vehicle they put through their system. Your competitor who's dumping stuff on the ground or letting it go into the metal, which is being received by the metals processor, he's got a lower cost of operation, lower labor costs. You're competing with him. So there's that competitive dislocation happening in the market because not everyone's operating to the same environmental standard. And of course, we have some operators. This was a fire that happened in Ontario, the province next to ours that we're in right now, Canada's largest province, that resulted in a fire near the country's capital. And the Minister of Environment actually had to go out and meet with council and talk about, yeah, we do need some standards for end-of-life vehicle processing. This happened in May, right, Steve? May. Governments are part of the problem. So governments are saying, yeah, we got an issue. Yeah, we see a need for an environmental standard, but we've got few resources to oversee and enforce such a standard. So we can put in a great law that's got a really tough recycling standard, but there's no way we're going to hire 500 inspectors and have them roam around the province, or have thousands of inspectors across Canada nationally, province by province, going and checking out auto recyclers. We don't have the money to do that. For us to have the money to do that, we would have to increase taxes. Nobody wants taxes increased. So they say, well, let's look at extended producer responsibility. Let's get the auto manufacturers to oversee recycling. Let's assign the responsibility of vehicles back to the auto manufacturers. That's where we come into extended producer responsibility, where governments say the end-of-life responsibility for vehicles or any other product belongs to the manufacturer of that product. And they use two rationales for saying, well, the guy who made it should take responsibility for it. One, let's shift the responsibility over to the manufacturers and away from municipalities. So it's the old mindset around packaging, right? It's how we got deposit systems in the blue box. Well, municipalities don't pick up the cost of end-of-life vehicles. Two, the provision of incentives to producers to design their products to be more green. So if they're paying for recycling and they have to take responsibility for recycling, then, gee, they'll make their products greener and easier to recycle. Well, this is a great theoretical concept, and I kind of give you an analogy of policymakers applying this to developed markets like we've got for auto recycling. The analogy I use is a whole bunch of virgins writing a sex manual. They've never had to negotiate a contract. They don't know how deals between an auto recycler and an insurance company and an auto body shop go. So it's all great in theory, but when you try to layer this onto, what was the number, $50-something billion market that's already working at a very high level, and you've got very complicated transactions. Some of you folks have been in business for decades, have got relationships that work like that to move parts or to buy vehicles. You're talking about taking that entire business and telling Ford, GM, Chrysler, Toyota to come in and take over that entire market and do something they know nothing about. They're not in the end-of-life vehicle recycling business. So their natural response is, holy smokes, we've got to do this, and we've seen this with electronics. We're all going to get together, we're going to put out a contract, and we're going to pick 5 auto recyclers in all of Canada, and they can get all the vehicles. And we don't want any parts reuse, because we don't know anything about parts reuse markets. We know we produce OE parts. So all of a sudden, they're not deriving any of the revenue that competitive businesses get from vehicles. they've just got a big cost. They got to get rid of these cars. That results in they have to charge consumers to cover their cost of recycling those vehicles. You get fees at the point of sale, eco fees. On the back end, they've now said, well, we got to get these vehicles recycled. Let's put a tender out. The 5 lowest bidders get all the vehicles and they can recycle them. What happens to the hundreds and hundreds of other auto recyclers that are out there? They're out of business. And that's exactly the model that was brought into Ontario for electronics recycling. And the program in Ontario is a disaster. So there's a lot of problems in Ontario with the electronics program because the government went ahead and regulated electronics recycling without understanding the electronics market before they went and did that. So again, you know, little or no understanding of the market. We go into government regularly to talk about the auto recycling business. And it's shocking when the province of Ontario, for example, which has Canada's manufacturing base for automobiles, they know a fair amount of auto manufacturing. You know, the manufacturers are in there, but the end-of-life business, they don't know what's being recycled. They have no idea about this level of sophistication. And over the years, Steve's now managed, when we go in there, they're starting to understand that, holy smokes, there are hundreds of businesses. There's a very sophisticated system for brokering parts between parties, an inventory and tracking system for these reusable parts that exists for no other recycled commodity that I know of, and I operate on a number of these programs. So there's a very sophisticated market. They're starting to understand that. They're understanding that just applying that concept of extended producer responsibility in a sort of, you know, very dogmatic way, like it's religion, without understanding the spiritual basis of it, which is competitive markets, which is your businesses, is going to result in a disaster. So you're going to get producer combines or monopolies. They're going to have less recycling, competitive recycling markets because they're automatically going to get consolidated down as the producers deal with only a few players. You're going to get eco fees, which are, you know, being called privatized taxation in Ontario. And one of the perverse effects is you actually get less reuse and recycling in some regulated markets, or many regulated markets, than you do in the free market system we have in North America. And so you'll see European jurisdictions that have EPR programs that don't have the level of reuse and recycling that we do in the free market, because all the entrepreneurial energy in the market, all of you folks, don't have the right incentives to do what you do here. So we've now got so now we've identified the problem is we don't have a common environmental standard, and we've now also taken a good look at the market is what are we trying to fix? So I've talked about electronics. I'm going to speed through this. So I'm going to speed through this too. Let's talk about what a reasonable policy, and I'm going to talk about Ontario, but Ontario is a template, what should apply or would be effective and efficient. And when I say efficient, I'm talking economic efficiency, which means doing things at least cost, which means harnessing your entrepreneurial energy to recycle more stuff, getting you guys excited about recycling, as or more recycling as you are now. Innovation. So if you've got a product or a part of a vehicle that's hard to recycle, you can, through your collective energies, figure out how to recycle it, or have a dialogue with the OEs, the OEMs, about why that's hard to recycle. So a forum for transfer of wealth and knowledge. You do a lot of that today, but can we create an environment that does that better without turning everything upside down and blowing it up? So we want to deal with the bad and not harm what's good. We've addressed the problem. We know that North America, Canada, is different than Europe. So trying to take a European model, even the model that you have in Netherlands or the UK, and trying to drop it wholesale into Ontario, not going to work. We're taxed differently. We have different sales taxes. We have different business taxes. We have a different market that's evolved. We have different commercial relationships. We have different border rules. We have all this stuff that's different. You can't just take someone else's laws and plunk it into Canada. And the fundamental assumption's got to be that when we're regulating, we want to preserve competitive markets, because we know they're already working. So what are the key elements? Well, we don't have a common standard. let's get a common standard. And the common standard has to be introduced in a way that when we introduce that standard, it doesn't put a whole bunch of businesses out of business. It's something that they can invest. If they're not meeting that standard, they can invest and grow to meet that standard. If you are meeting the standard, well, then that's fine. So we need a high, effective common standard to deal with all of the nasty stuff that's not being properly managed by some businesses without putting a lot of those businesses out of business at the start. We need to have that verified, and that goes back to the UK problem. If you're not verifying and ensuring everyone's complying, well, then you're going to get free riders, and free riders are going to, be playing in your market while not meeting the same standard. To have that oversight, you need a dedicated body to do it. You can't rely on government, so you need to have an organization that's focused on maintaining that environmental standard. It's got a license, end-of-life vehicle processors, so that's a good thing we've learned from Europe, that licensing works. You can't receive a vehicle unless you're licensed. Oversees and audits processors against the standard. That's reasonable. Collects data on reuse and recycling, which we then can feed over to Susan for life cycle work, so we can quantify the environmental benefits. We know what we're getting back. We know where it's going. We know what the mass balance of material is that's coming in and what's going out, and what the benefit of what we're doing is. And also, that has the wherewithal to undertake and do research to identify materials that are harder to process and either work on technologies to deal with that material that yield reusable and recyclable commodities, therefore improving the environmental practice, or turning around to the OEs and saying, we've got a problem with this material, can we talk about what we might do with that? And then this becomes also an organization that can interact with other organizations that exist and becomes an information clearinghouse. So market oversight. So you can't receive a vehicle, just to reiterate, you can't receive a vehicle unless you're licensed. How's the thing paid for? Well, here's where the rubber hits the road. Here's the dialogue that happens. If you're going to get the manufacturers to pay for this system, if I'm a manufacturer, if I'm Ford and I'm paying to oversee the system, I want some control on the system. I want some control on the materials. I want to have some say about what gets reused and what gets recycled. If the recyclers are paying a licensing fee and paying into a pool, and that pool is used by an independent oversight body to regulate the market, well, that independent body has got no skin in the game other than to maintain the standard. So if you're paying a licensing fee, and that licensing fee is derived from the revenues that you're now getting from the flow of vehicles going through legitimate recyclers, the model is effectively self-financing. So, based on the number of vehicles that are available, it would take a nominal fee, would cover all of the enforcement and oversight and auditing to maintain a level playing field for all players in the market. Whether they're shredding vehicles, crushing vehicles, or dismantling vehicles, they would have to meet that set environmental standard. Anyone with an end-of-life vehicle can drop it off at a licensed processing facility at no charge. So, one of the other elements, and I haven't talked about promotion and education, but once you've got this framework, then it's ideal to have the things that Summerhill Group are doing, or Recycle Your Ride program, or all these various programs, Adieu Bazoo that we have in Quebec, porting into this, and there's an assurance that your vehicle is getting recycled to a high standard, and there's no disruption of the competitive market. I don't want to go through the environmental standard. We've taken the National Code of Practice, and Doug Mander's in the room here somewhere, so bug Doug about this. There he is over there. We've taken the National Code and embellished it. We've looked at best practices globally and have said these are the materials that need to be in the basic standard. And there they are there. The tracking system, we've got pretty good tracking systems for reusable components. There's also a mass balance calculation that on average of a vehicle of a certain weight, you're going to get certain materials out of it. You would need to track each vehicle that comes in. So one of the things that would have to happen is you need to have auditing and reporting. Auditing and reporting, there would be a requirement for recyclers that are licensed receiving vehicles to provide certain information to the oversight body so we could measure what it is that we're doing and measure the benefit. We don't talk about diversion targets because setting a diversion targets for vehicles in Ontario, recovering or figuring out what we're recovering of what's sold is a bizarre exercise, because what you're selling today is not coming out of the market we're hearing for a longer and longer period. It's an artificial number. What we need to be getting is the aggregate data of what's coming out of the market, the mass balance of vehicles going out of the province, what's staying here, and what's happening to that, to get an idea over a number of years of how much material we can expect per capita and what we should see over time as vehicles are sold. You cannot develop diversion targets at the outset. You're doomed to failure. You're doomed to either overestimate how much you're going to get back, or overestimate your target or underestimate your target. So maintaining records is key. Reporting annually to the oversight body. The oversight body would then put out an annual report that would, like an annual stewardship report, that would describe the aggregate activity of all the licensed parties in the province or in Canada as you scale this up. So there's a number of models for the oversight body, and I'm not going to get into any detail, but in Ontario we have the Ontario Safety and Consumer Statute Administration Act, which allows the government to create these types of oversight bodies. And so you've got the Ontario Motor Vehicle Industry Council, the Technical Standards and Safety Association. They're all like agencies that regulate their members. So OMVIC in Ontario regulates auto dealerships. They've got a code of conduct and a code of practice, and dealerships have to meet that code of conduct and code of practice, and they fund the running of OMVIC. For the same reason that we're talking about creating an organization here, is so that all dealers are operating to a common standard and a common code of conduct. We've got a level playing field in the market. The environmental standards would be set through various environmental laws, and like Europe, one of the things that we would use to track vehicles is the vehicle identification number. That would be the basis on which everything through the system's tracked, much as it is today at the Ministry of Transportation. How we envision it is that the oversight agency, the licensing body for end-of-life vehicle processors, would assume the responsibility of receiving that information from the licensed parties and providing that to the government to say, here's how many vehicles were retired in this province or nationally. Governance, how this body would be governed, we see it being governed by dismantler licensees, shredder-crusher licensees, OEMs, either companies or associations, and government-appointed board members. They might appoint consumer advocates or environmental groups, but this is the type of organizational governance that we see. And so, what does this mean for the OEMs? I think it means something a lot different. This model would mean something a lot different for the auto manufacturers than it does for the electronics manufacturers who are suffering under some of the programs that exist in Canada today. I think the market delivers the solution. There's no consumer fees in this program. There's low administrative cost. There's freedom and flexibility. So what this says is, if I am Toyota and I want to get back my lithium batteries for some reason, this does not preclude me from going into the market and having a relationship with a subset of the licensees that are out there, the licensed recyclers, and saying, I want you to be a dedicated return and processing facility for my battery. So it gives the manufacturers the ability to have whatever free market relationships they want to have with the universe of licensed auto recyclers. That doesn't exist today in Ontario, for instance. It's very, very difficult for a Hewlett-Packard to have a relationship with one recycler. Everything has to go through the program. That's not the case with what we're proposing here. The equipment manufacturers' efforts lie primarily on communications, governance of the licensing body, and working with the recyclers on R&D for hard-to-recycle materials. And of course, information exchange, functioning markets only work well if there's a good exchange of information. This organization would also act as a center of best practices and exchange of information. So that's in a nutshell what we've been working on. What we've created is basically by watching some of the less successful programs in Canada, looking at what's going on in Europe and Southeast Asia and Asia, and saying, what can we learn from those jurisdictions, what we're seeing here, and about how successful the free market's been to date with auto recycling, and what's the optimal model that delivers those win-win-win-win-wins, as Steve talks about. How can we add another win on there for the environment and for the auto recycling industry and for the auto manufacturers themselves? So that's pretty well it. I'll be around if you have any questions.
And just so you understand the context of this, the Americans are probably going, what? You're talking about what? You know, and several jurisdictions who already have it are probably going, well, yeah, we didn't really have a say, it just sort of came to us. But Canada, and specifically Ontario, is going down the EPR path, whether we like it or not. They've already designated packaging, tires, electronics, about 30 household hazardous waste. And they have announced vehicles as an item that they would like to be underneath an EPR banner. So we're, as I introduced Usman, you know, looking at this as an opportunity and a threat all at the same time. But we're in a somewhat unusual place in that we see it coming. So we can sit back and say, no, we don't want this to happen, and it may happen anyways, or we could be the ones holding the pen and trying to write it in the right way. And we do that through some of these international relationships. You know, we've had Casper come to Ontario and talk to our regulators and various people to just get a feel for what's there, you know, and Casper's been great at saying, don't do what we did, because we didn't do it right, because we were ahead of everything. So it's a concept that we're not pushing, but we're certainly seeing it as an opportunity to solve a number of the problems that we have if done right. So it's exciting and terrifying all at the same time.